Hello, BookTube. Among the many read-alongs and readathons and buddy reads and whatnot that I have been failing at in the month of July, none has been closer to my heart than the read-along that's been done by Matthew at Mayberry Book Club of Boswell's Life of Johnson. I was supposed to be right involved with this hip and cheek, but I have been feeling under the weather. I still am, but I have been incredibly encouraged, whether I've been participating or not. I've been incredibly encouraged by the people who have been emailing me. I leave my email on every video, and the people who have been emailing me saying, well, I pulled this down, or I ordered it because of you and Matthew, because of your read-along, and I got to tell you, I was really apprehensive because it's 1,300 pages long, and it's about an 18th century English intellectual about whom I know nothing. And I don't read biographies anyway, and this is by far the biggest that I've ever tried to read, and I'm put off by it. I don't know how I'm going to get along with it whatsoever. I've had quite a few people email me and say, what approach do you recommend? How do you suggest that I get over the intimidation factor of this gigantic monster of a book? And quite a few of those people have said, I think I know what your answer will be, because you've given it many times before. Your answer will be go to Wikipedia, read up on the basics, demystify the thing, maybe watch a crash course on YouTube or something like that. But in the case of Boswell's Life of Johnson, my answer is quite different than that. All those things are good to do. But my answer with Boswell's Life of Johnson is just start reading. Just start reading the book. Skip the introduction. Don't worry about the notes. Just start reading. And you'll see. And quite a few people took me up on that, and all of them have reported back favorably. In fact, stunned, awestruck at what this is. It in every single case where I have talked to somebody, it is not what they were expecting at all. And I understand that, because this is billed as one of the greatest biographies that's ever been written, but it doesn't read like any other biography that you've ever read. It reads much closer to the unplanned, prismatic, disproportionate way that you actually know someone when you know them in real life, and not at all like The Shadow in the Garden, as one famous literary figure put it about his authorized biographer, who was always waiting and always taking down notes. The Shadow in the Garden is how that unctuous figure was referred to, because there the goal was very much to write an official biography, and nothing, no jot or tittle, was allowed to fall by the wayside. And it added an incredibly studied, stilted tone to everything. And my belief is that in all but a few cases, that stilted tone carries over to the written word. So that if you've ever read an actual biography, especially a biography written by someone who knew their subject personally, and knew their subject particularly, specifically in the context of assembling a biography of them, if you went into this book expecting one of those books, no wonder you came out confused, because it doesn't read anything like that at all. Now that is, I think, attributable to two things. One is that Johnson and Boswell didn't spend all that much time together. The natural way that people think when they just know about this book but haven't read it, or haven't read any biographies of either man, the natural way they think of it is The Shadow in the Garden. They think, oh, well, Boswell must have been stuck like a leech to this guy forever and ever. But in the sum total of both their whole lives, they barely interacted at all. It's a very, very small amount, especially for such an enormous book. And the other factor is Boswell himself as a writer, who is so immensely personable. He is so immensely real. Even when he's not being likable, you like him. And always you feel that you are being simply spoken to as an ordinary person, by an ordinary person. I know of virtually no writer in the English language who annihilates the intervening distance in years and cultures and customs and countries between himself and his readers as effectively as Boswell does. It goes away immediately. It shakes people. And I've known people over the years who have read this book unabridged at my urging, and I've heard from so many of those people that when they finished huge chunks of it, they would tell me, okay, well, kids have been fed, husband's been fed, everybody's settled, I'm going to read just 50 pages tonight because I've got work to do. I'm just going to allow myself 50 pages. And then they read 150 pages, 200 pages, and their response on the old rotary telephone where I used to get those responses was that when I stopped reading, this particular response comes from one person whose most famous book you have certainly read. but this response was echoed by many, many other people. And her response was, late at night, was the first startling realization that I had when I stopped my reading was how long I had been going beyond my plan. But my second startling realization was much worse and almost painful, and that was that Boswell isn't alive. I've been having this wonderful conversation with this person who, warts and all, I am coming to like, and yet when I close the book I realize he's been dead for centuries. How can that possibly be? How can anyone write like this? I agree. I agree completely. Johnson himself might seem at times remote, or doubly remote, because he is very much a figure of his time and doesn't write like Boswell at all. And also because even in his own time, people found him off-putting. They found him strange, even in his own time. I'm going to read you a little excerpt that underscores that. But you get that over and over again in this book. Boswell repeats it so often that you know two things have to be true. One, he must have felt it himself. So none of this, we were the best of friends, he was like a father to me business. And two, he must have known that that aspect of Johnson would sell his book. And boy, was he right. He was right on the second part. So I imagine the first part was true as well. But those two things, those two factors that keep Johnson at a bit of a remove, no matter how much we might admire him, no matter how much we might love reading him, they aren't true for Boswell. Boswell is immediate. He's in the room with you. And that makes this an unbelievable reading experience of a type that biographers almost never even try anymore. Much less succeed. That you even if you were to try, you'd almost never succeed. For a biographer to take this kind of tone, this kind of I knew him well, but I also am a storyteller tone, it happened last year. George Packer took something of that, of a Boswellian tone, for his biography of Dick Holbrook, our man. There was something of that attitude in the book, and boy, oh boy, did it strike a chord with its readers and reviewers. They know they're not reading a normal, full-dress, doilies-on biography, and that feeling is 100,000 times more in this book, where Boswell is just sort of going along. He's collecting information, yes, but the book is also just a miasma of impressions, his own and other people's. And I wanted to read you one of those. It's from, let's see here, Tuesday, or Monday, March 19th, 1781. I arrived in London, and on Tuesday the 20th, met him, that's Johnson, in Fleet Street, walking, or rather indeed moving along, for his peculiar march is thus described in a very just and picturesque manner in a short life of him published very soon after his death. Quote, when he walked the streets, with the constant roll of his head and the concomitant motion of his body, he appeared to make his way by that motion independent of his feet. Close quote. That he was often much stared at while he advanced in this manner may be easily believed, but it was not safe to make sport of one so robust as he was. This is not to say that Johnson was a violent person. He was loud, and he had a huge cudgel that he walked with, that helped to steady him when he walked. As you can tell, his walk was unsteady. It wasn't that he was violent, and it wasn't the cudgel, it's that he himself was enormous. He didn't look like an easy target for ridicule or mockery. Mr. Langton saw him one day in a fit of absence, by a sudden start, drive the load off a porter's back and walk forward briskly, without being conscious of what he had done. The porter was very angry, but stood still and eyed the huge figure with much earnestness, till he was satisfied that his wisest course was to be quiet and take up his burthen again. Our accidental meeting in the street after a long separation was a pleasing surprise to both of us. He stepped aside me into Falcon Court and made kind inquiries about my family, and as we were in a hurry going different ways, I promised to call on him next day. He said he was engaged to go on in the morning. Early, sir, said I. Johnson said, why, sir, a London morning does not go with the sun. I waited on him next evening, and he gave me a great portion of his original manuscript of the Lives of the Poets, which he had preserved for me. Notice, there's a lot going on there. First of all, I beg you to entertain the possibility that the meeting was not accidental. just entertain that possibility. You can love James Boswell. You can sympathize with him. You can wince at his indiscretions and his stupidities and his vanities, but you must not ever believe him. Believe the sense of what he's saying. But the specifics, oh my, oh my. You want to be very careful to believe the specifics. I myself do not believe for an instant that the meeting was accidental. But nevertheless, I do believe the gist of it. The feeling, the general impression that you get that Johnson was lost in his own world a lot of the time, that he was unaware of the swath he was leaving behind him when he was doing this monstrous, ponderous, teetering walk around the London streets. I believe that. I believe that image completely. So the thing that I want to point out about that moment, that is just struck off. Notice how much isn't there, right? I mean, if this were a normal, authorized 1,400-page biography of a great man, you'd get that whole encounter. All you get is a witticism. You get told that they inquired about each other's families, but a normal, obsequious, official author, the Shadow in the Garden, would record every single word that was said in that encounter, and maybe get a deposition from that disgruntled porter. Instead, we get the barest sketch. And bare sketches are not what you associate with a book this huge, but that's the feeling that you have when you're reading this, always wanting more. Not necessarily in a negative way, because Boswell is a fantastic scene drawer. That scene is beautifully drawn. I'm not sure in terms of drama that I would change a word of it. But in terms of being curious what it's like to know Dr. Johnson, I would add a lot to that scene. But the thing that I want to point out two things about it as in this read-along. I will try to be more faithful with this read-along because it deserves more readers than it's getting. Although like I mentioned, I'm incredibly enheartened by the readers that have been in contact with me, because it means this book still has the power to utterly beguile, and I love that. I love knowing that. But there are two things that I want to point out about that. First is that whether we believe Boswell or not about that being a chance meeting, whether we believe that or not, it very much feels like one. It feels like what it would feel like if you met a friend unexpectedly on the street and you inquire, your schedules don't match, but you're folding the anecdote about the meeting into a larger anecdote which is about the manuscript. And Boswell has just previous to that moment written at enormous length about that manuscript. The only one. He stresses he's the only one who has the whole manuscript of it, and also about the book, The Lives of the Poets. This is an addendum to that, and is a really well-drawn scene, and really, I think, accurately reflects what it's like to just run into somebody, especially those of you who were adults before the internet, before cell phones. When you did run into somebody on Main Street or the High Street, where you did run into somebody on campus and you weren't expecting it, and maybe your plans didn't coalesce perfectly, but you would get back together. This is what it was like. Before we could coordinate every movement with somebody else, all having identical electronic devices in our hands, before that was possible, this is what it was like. And Boswell captures that over and over again in this book with perfect fidelity. The other thing I want to point out about that moment is that it takes place on page 805 of this book. So there's been no careful orchestration. There's been no planning. Boswell is still giving us, even on page 800, he's still giving us fleeting glimpses of this person. And other people's fleeting glimpses of him. This is not just Boswell. When it comes time for him to convey the point of that little anecdote, which is how oddly Johnson made his way through the crowds of London, he doesn't even really do it himself. He quotes somebody else. In other words, it feels like maybe an opening impression, a strong impression that you would get at the beginning of a much shorter book instead of on page 800 of a much longer book. And the point I want to make about that is that is part of the magic of this book, is that everything is fresh. Everything is just a meeting in a shop, at a ball, on a street corner, and something that happened then that was a flash that is just caught perfectly. That is what you will encounter in this book over and over again. You still get a gigantic, concentrated impression of a man. Absolutely, you do. Much like you would in a conventional biography, but not through any conventional means. That's what the wonder of this book is that you never had anything like it in your life. So I always find it kind of funny that is true. That oftentimes the standard bearers for a genre will not look like anything else in that genre. Boswell's Life of Johnson has often been called the greatest biography ever written, and yet it's like no other biography ever written. Same thing with The Tale of Genji. It's often called the greatest novel ever written, the first and the greatest novel ever written, and yet it's drastically unlike most other novels ever written. I always find that kind of funny. It's definitely true in this case. So, of course, I've been dilatory with this read-along, but in the comments I would love to hear. I've heard from a lot of you via email, but in the comments I would love to hear whether or not you're making any peace with this book, whether or not you've tried it, whether or not you are trying it for this read-along. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I will talk about this again before the read-along ends, just so that Matthew doesn't disinherit me. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.